All right, we're going to be doing something a little bit different today, and that's going to pretty much involve this Chevy Tracker engine right here. This engine is not from one of the current Trackers on the lot. This is a spare one we picked up from a scrapyard, and we were told it has a bad head gasket, but it still turns over just fine. But rather than just tear it apart to replace a head gasket, or even a head gasket and timing chain, might as well just rebuild the stupid thing. Which, at that point, we're just talking about pulling the bottom end apart and putting some fresh rings and bearings in there. And then, of course, doing the timing chain and head gasket. So, I'm going to go ahead and get started tearing this thing apart because there's several things that have to obviously come loose here. First and foremost, the exhaust and intake manifolds. Already took the flywheel off in order to get this thing mounted on the rear here of the stand. Then, of course, get the other peripheral components off, like the water pump, timing pulley, the pulleys on the timing cover, a couple other little odds and ends. Probably don't even have to mess with these motor mount brackets because they're really not in the way. And, of course, all this excess wiring and tubing that's really not going to be necessary because when they pulled it from the original vehicle, they were conveniently taking all this stuff off to give to me. So I got a bunch of extra wiring, but we don't need it. So, yeah, go ahead and get started with this. We're going to do something a little bit different here when it comes to this little project. I'm just going to start pulling stuff apart, and I'm going to make note of the different size fasteners so you'll be able to know what you'll need tool-wise. But I'm going to actually be bagging up a lot of this stuff and marking it in order to know what I have so we don't have any issues with leftover bolts or mysteriously missing bolts. So I'm going to start with this exhaust manifold and knock these things off so I could get that part off first. And then probably while I'm at it in there, since I have to pull it off, I need to pull this coolant tube off since it's right there in the way. Then we're going to go to the other side and start working on the intake. So let's get this stuff off. Got the timing cover all off, a lot of the extra hardware that puts tension on the timing chain, as well as the crank pulley or sprocket. Now, the next thing is we're going to have to pull our two camshafts off so we can get all this off and expose the bolts for the head here. And all our camshaft caps are labeled, so you really can't get them mixed up. The only ones that aren't marked are the ones at the front. This cap's not labeled, everything else is, except that one there. And it even has arrows on there, so you can't even get the direction wrong. So we're going to go ahead and pull all this crap off, like a bunch of 10mm bolts, and go ahead and get our rest of our timing crap off and get our head off. Let's go. crank to intermediate sprocket chain and intermediate sprocket here. With all that removed, along with all the other crap on the front here, we're ready to attack our head bolts. And those are 14mm hex head, so this should be relatively easy. So let's continue. Alright, we managed to get all our head bolts loosened up, some of them removed. Still got a couple more left to pull out, but they're all loose. As would be expected with hex head bolts that are super tight, you end up running into a problem. If we focus here, let's see, we focus, come on, focus, there we go. And come on, you little booger. We'll just do that. You end up rounding out the hex head, and your tool's gonna slip, and you'll never get this thing out. Solution to that thing is a bolt extractor socket that allows this thing to just grab onto even the shittiest of bolt heads and apply the necessary incredible Hulk torque to break these stubborn bolts and save the day. Otherwise, well, I don't know, maybe you need to destroy your cylinder head to get the thing out, I don't know. But we got all our bolts out. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 bolts here that you got to get out. 14mm head or bolt extractor, 14mm 9/16. So with that all said and done, we should be able to pull this garbage off and see what the inside of this thing looks like. In case you hadn't found it already, before you could fully pull this head off, there's a little bitty 5mm Allen wrench bolt right here you got to remove. Make sure you get that out of there, otherwise you're going to break something if you try to knock this head off prior to that. Alright, looking at this head gasket, it's clearly shot. So, yep. Everything else looks about as normal as one would expect to see on a used engine. A little bit of carbon, not too horrifying. Of course, with these engines being all aluminum, at least you ain't got to worry about a bunch of rust, other than the crankshaft, of course. And that's where we're going to be heading next, because I got to flip this thing upside down and get the oil pan off. And I believe that's a bunch of 10mm bolts, so we're going to go ahead and get that off next. Looking at the bottom end here, everything looks pretty good as far as being covered in oil, even though the oil I drained out of there was nasty because there was water mixed in it. Anyway, what we're going to be looking at here is removing our connecting rod caps, which are 13mm hex head nuts, and we're going to have to move on to what is basically the bottom half of the block, because the block is actually a two-part assembly. In order to get our crankshaft out, we have to take the block apart. And those consist of several of these 12-point bolts. So, yeah, let's first go ahead and get our caps off for the rods, get the pistons out, and then we're going to probably have to take this whole block off of the stand in order to separate this trash. So, let's continue. Looking at the rod bearing cap on our piston, it's got what looks like a V, but you can actually utilize it as a symbol of what direction to orient the piston when you put it all back together. I put the caps on the corresponding pistons as I took them out. That way, along with our symbol, we'll know exactly how to put these things back in here when we start assembling everything. So, yep, just another little piece of info. Before we can get our blocks separated and even get the thing off, I'm gonna have to remove these motor mount brackets here. Those are just 14mm bolts. Got a couple up there and a couple down there, or down there or up there, however you want to look at it. But 2 brackets, 14mm bolts, 8 in total. Go ahead and get those off, and then start looking at getting this block off the stand. All right, at the very front of this thing, there's a chain guide for the oil pump chain right here. Probably going to be a good idea to pull that off. It looks like it's just some 10mm nuts right here attached to the studs that hold this piece in place. So go ahead and get that out of the way, and then we're going to go ahead and address these 12-point bolts all through here, and probably in the same process get this block on the ground. Okay, after getting our bolts along the outside and along this point here that hold, I guess, what we would call our main bearing block half together, you got 10 12-point bolts along the middle here. They're all 10mm 12-point, and you are going to need a 10mm 12-point socket because these things are in here pretty tight. Don't try to use a wrench. You'll destroy your wrench, and preferably you'll want 1.5 inch for the socket because you will need a breaker bar to break these super tight bolts. So I already took the liberty of breaking all these bolts so it doesn't sit here looking like I'm trying to take a dump while I'm trying to break these bolts, because like I said, they're super tight. So I'm going to get these bolts off, and at that rate, just before I get the last of them out, we are going to have to get this thing on the ground because both halves are bolted up to our stand right here, and to separate it, it's all got to come apart. So let me get this done. Okay, 2 things to make note of after we got everything apart. As far as those bolts that we pulled loose to separate our bearing block half, I don't know if it matters or not, but I'm kind of used to the idea of putting everything back exactly the way it was. Same goes for the bolts. So I just made a little template here designating the orientation of the engine left and right and which bolts are which, so they all go exactly in their same spot when we reassemble this thing. And right here we have our 2-part engine block setup. Like I say, this whole thing here is basically what takes place of our main bearing caps. Just one whole piece. Seems like a good idea in one area. Probably a bad idea in other areas, who knows. Foreign engineering. But everything actually looks pretty good on the bottom end, all things considered. Our main bearings are still in pretty good shape. No copper showing. Stuff's still getting replaced though. We're starting off fresh. But this is what we're dealing with right here. Gonna have to go ahead and clean all this stuff up and prep our bearings. Put all that stuff in there. Same thing with our crankshaft here. Clean it up and get it ready to rock and roll. Have rear main seal to put in there. Basically everything necessary to get this engine back to where it needs to be. So that's going to be next. Rings, bearings, crankshaft, all that good stuff. So as usual, stand by. All right, took a second to spray all this garbage down with some engine degreaser and get it all cleaned up. So both crankcase halves are clean and ready to go, especially all the bearing spots. Same thing with the crankshaft. So the next thing I'm going to do is get our main bearings, get them oiled up, and slap all that trash together on both halves so we can get our crank in place. Alright, took a moment to put some fresh oil in a bowl for these bearings. There's also another thing you also want to make sure you install are these little shims that go in the middle bearing section. And they're to help keep the crankshaft from doing this drifting action that can occur. But with all this garbage oiled up, we can go ahead and start installing this stuff. One other thing to make note of, if you hadn't rebuilt an engine before, there's little dimples or notches or whatever, and this is so you can install the bearings one way and not get anything backwards, since you do have oil passages on the bearings to allow oil to circulate through the block and onto the crankshaft and all that other good stuff inside. So I'm going to go ahead and slap these bearings in real quick. Get back to you in a second. Alright, we got our main bearings in place. The ones without the holes go in the bottom half of the crankcase right here, and our top half gets the ones with the holes. Everything is in place with the grooves as mentioned. Our thrust bearings are also installed with the little oil grooves facing out. One other thing you better make sure of before you slap this stuff together, there's a little O-ring right here you need to replace, and that should be in your rebuild kit. I'm going to go ahead and get that in real quick, and then I'm going to get our crankshaft with the oil pump chain still on there and put it in here so we can go ahead and put the two crankcase halves together. Alright, we got our crankshaft in place. Took a little oil and put it over the main bearing areas of the crankshaft. The next thing you got to do is put some sealer or gasket maker or RTV gasket maker. I've seen people use all of that, black gasket maker, gray RTV gasket maker. Main thing is you got to put a bead of it from about right here where my finger is at, all along this outer edge right here, and all the way to this point right here, and then the same thing there going all the way around, outer edge there, and up to that point right there to help seal the two crankcase halves so it doesn't leak out of the sides. Also, you don't put anything around here where it gets near the main bearings, because that could be a problem for you later on. Don't just get happy with the gasket maker slapping it all over the place. Follow that outer edge going along there. I'm going to link a couple websites that have some shop information on what to do with these engines when you're reassembling them. Useful stuff, torque specs, all that good stuff. So let me go ahead and get the gasket maker on here and get these two crankcase halves put back together. Alright, as you noticed, upon assembling the two crankcase halves together, you need to pay attention to your oil pump chain and make sure you hold the chain up and get it to where it's inside this little guide piece right here on the bottom crankcase half. Because if you just slap it together with the chain just laying there on the crankshaft, it's going to be on this side right here, and then you're going to have to pull it all apart again and get it back together exactly as you see it right here. So we got everything put together. See just a light oozing of gasket maker around that on the inside. I will probably get a little bit of rag in there or something to get that out. Then I'm going to put all our bolts in there and torque all this stuff down. Alright, one of the instructions on the web that I saw mentioned when you put your main bearing bolts in place, put a little oil on the treads before putting them in place. This is an aluminum block after all. Anyway, torque sequence, just like with cylinder heads or whatnot, start from the middle. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Do it in two sequences. First one is 30.5 foot-pounds and the other one is 43.5 foot-pounds. Now I got an old school analog torque wrench, so we're really probably going to end up hitting something like 31 and 44 foot-pounds, give or take. So anyway, I'm going to go ahead and do our two-part sequence. Like I said, starting from the middle, alternating out, 30 and a half, 43 and a half. Our outer crankcase bolts right here, and well, they're not outer, they're inside, but still, these are the secondary ones. These are tightened down to 19 and a half foot-pounds. Not as much as the main bearing bolts, but they still need to be torqued down in a sequence, same as the main bearing bolts, starting from the middle and then working your way out in a crisscross pattern. So no two-part sequence, just a sequential tighten down to 19 and a half foot-pounds. I'll go ahead and knock that out off camera, so then we can go ahead and get this thing back on the stand. Before we can get this thing back on the stand, there is a matter of our rear main seal, because our plate's going to be covering half of this area up, so even the instructions recommend getting this thing in place before you move on, probably for the same reasons. Our rear main seal is a one-piece unit that is pressed in here. Put a little oil on this thing on both sides to help preserve the integrity of this rubbery material and to help install it a little bit safely. I'll use a block of 2x4 and just carefully work the thing in all the way around so it doesn't go in crooked. Done this job once before on the same engine, or the same class of engine for the Tracker, and process remains the same. So let me go ahead and get this thing put in here, and then we'll get this on the stand. All right, one of the things you're going to want to do is take a moment to clean these pistons off, because they're probably going to have a lot of carbon in there, and you don't want all that trash in there when you put your new rings in there. Now, use whatever you have available. Picks, flathead screwdriver that's small, whatever our bootleg minds can come up with. We'll figure out something to be able to get in these grooves and get all the trash out. One of the things you'll want to do is pay attention to these little oil passage holes on the oil ring right here. You want to make sure those things are clear. Otherwise, you might not get the oil you need to help lubricate your piston, and that's going to shorten the life of the rings, piston, and the block possibly. I had to actually take a fine drill bit and go through these holes because this engine was so caked up with crap that stuff was actually plugging up the holes. So I had to carefully drill through all that garbage to clean those holes out. As we could see, everything is still straight on here. This is number 1 cylinder, or piston, I mean. So it's ready to go. Now, you might be wondering what this marking is on here. It's to designate the orientation for our rings. According to the manual that I found, right here and here would be for our oil rings. When you put those on there, you got a top and a bottom oil ring that go right here. The bottom one gets oriented right here, and the top one would be right there. And then as far as these right here, your bottom one will be right here, top one will be right here, the number 1 ring right there. So this just helps to kind of set the thing in a roundabout area. It's not exactly precise, but you know what I mean. Go ahead and put these rings on here and go ahead and get this thing ready to knock into the engine. Okay, one other thing to make note of, the second piston ring, it has to go in a certain way. Now, these piston rings were at least nice enough to be labeled top on them, because there's a little taper that you could clearly see right there where my fingernail is at, and they have to go on a certain way, which, as that shows, these are on the top, so they would go in like this on that second line right there. So just make note of that. So in case your rings don't have a label on there, you want that little taper on the bottom, not on the top, unless yours say top. Let me get this garbage together. All right, we got our number 1 piston covered up. As stated before, number 2 ring is at the 7 o'clock position. Number 1 is at the 2 or 3 o'clock position. The bottom oil ring is at the 4 o'clock position, and the top one is at the 10 o'clock position. You got a little arrow right there on the top of the piston to show that this is the front side of the piston. So with that all said and done, we're going to get our compressor tool, squeeze that garbage on there, and flip that block right side up so we can go ahead and start tapping these pistons in place. All 3 of these other ones here are already taken care of off camera, so let's continue. This time, once you get a piston in place, you obviously don't want to just beat the thing straight through, because there's a matter of the connecting rod bearings, and we got those there. Should be able to get it in there and obviously match the groove up, get it all in place there, and then just rotate the crankshaft as well as push the piston up to get the two to mate together, and then put the other bearing half on the rod cap, get them in place, put the nuts on there, but we're not going to torque them down yet. We're going to wait till we have everything in place, then we're going to torque stuff down. All right, after moving both the connecting rod, piston, and crankshaft to get everything lined up enough, got our bearing cap in place. Again, there's a little thing that would look like a V in one direction, but we're using it as an arrow to indicate that direction for the cap. Again, we're not torquing down the nuts yet because we want to get everything else in place. But as we can clearly see here, everything still turned. I can't do it with one hand because I got to hold the chain here. But yeah, everything does move. So go ahead and get the rest of these in there, and then we'll get to torquing. All right, we got all 4 pistons in place, connecting rods, bearings, caps, everything are in place. The directions are correct as noted before. The nuts that are holding the rod caps in place are 13 millimeter, and the specs say to tighten them down to 33 foot-pounds. Nothing really special, just tighten them down to 33 foot-pounds. So I'm going to go ahead and do that off camera, and we'll get back to see if this thing spins freely. Stand by. All right, got all our bearing caps in place, torqued down, 33 foot-pounds. Took the liberty of putting the crank bolt on here and turning it right side up so the oil pump chain hangs freely so it doesn't get bound up, because it's a pain in the ass otherwise. But everything rotates freely. This damn chain doesn't want to catch. It'll rotate. But, yep. We're good and ready to go on that. So now, speaking of oil pumps, that'll be the next thing. All right. Next thing we got to do is install our oil pump. Pretty simple process. Done this before on the other Tracker engine. But, thing is held in place by 3 12 millimeter bolts, all torqued down to 19.5 foot-pounds. Obviously, when you put it on, you're going to have to make sure to have your chain situated so you can get everything in place good. Also, you got our chain guide here that you'll need to re-secure with 10 millimeter bolts, or not bolts, nuts right here torque down to like 8 foot-pounds, not much. On the oil pump, there is a metal bushing right here that you have to make sure is in place, and make sure that there's not another one sitting here in the block. So this is a new oil pump because they're pretty cheap, and rather than take a chance with an old oil pump that was on this engine, I'll just go ahead and get a new one off of Amazon or eBay or whatever, like 30-something bucks, give or take. So why not replace it? So with that in there, I'm going to get the bolts in. And one other thing I need to do is throw a little oil inside here and rotate this thing to get the insides lubricated some before we put our pickup on, which is held in place by two 10mm bolts, torqued down to 8 foot-pounds. And put our cover on, which is also held in place with 10mm bolts, 2 on the top, 2 on the block, also 8 foot-pounds. So we'll go ahead and get all this garbage together real quick. One thing to make note of before we finish assembling all our oil system components, the oil pickup tube. There's an O-ring that goes on here where it mates up to the oil pump. Your rebuild kit should have these little bits and pieces, so install a new O-ring on there, put a little oil on it so it'll slide onto everything without damaging the O-ring. Obviously put the O-ring on the tube so you could just put it into the oil pump. The oil pickup tube is held in place by 3 10mm bolts, 2 here and 1 on the block, all torqued down to 8 foot-pounds. So with that, go ahead and get this thing on. All right, with all our oil stuff in place, the next thing is the oil pan gasket. Now, you'll obviously want to make sure all surfaces are clean on the pan and on the block, and you'll want to go ahead and glue down your gasket. Since we're not actually putting this thing back in an engine that's in the car, we can actually afford to just slap everything together and get it on the block, because we'll be able to more easily line everything up with the engine on our stand compared to sliding underneath the car to try to make sure everything stays in place. Normally I go ahead and glue the gasket onto the pan first with some gasket maker, then layer around the lip of the pan, put the gasket down, let it sit, and then apply a little bit more on the other side of the gasket where it's going to mate with the block. So we'll go ahead and get some more gasket maker on there, throw this on here, and then we'll go ahead and put all our 10mm bolts in and torque them down to 8 foot-pounds so we can go ahead and conclude the absolute bottom end of the engine build. One thing to make note of when it comes to putting your oil pan on and torquing the bolts down, even though the instruction that I found online says to torque this thing down to 8 foot-pounds, this pan appeared to not actually have a gasket. It was just a big bead of gasket maker going all the way around, sealing the pan to the block. So with that in mind, 8 foot-pounds to secure this thing metal to almost metal with a thin layer of gasket maker would make sense. Trying to torque this thing down to 8 foot-pounds causes a few pinches to occur on the gasket, which we cannot have. So more accurately, with a gasket, the torque specs are probably somewhere around 5 foot-pounds maybe. I'm just guessing, but you have to use some discretion as you torque it down, and really you're not using a torque wrench, you're just kind of tightening it until you see the gasket start to distort a little bit and the gasket maker ooze out. So again, use discretion when you tighten all your bolts up so you don't damage your gasket. Before we put our cylinder head on, one little thing you might want to check depending on the condition of your engine. There's a little check valve that goes in here with a little check ball. You're going to want to pull this out and make sure that it's not clogged or otherwise unusable. This one, fortunately, is in good shape, so I could put this back in. Alright, we are now at the cylinder head gasket, the main reason for actually tearing this engine down in the first place. I had already taken time to use a wire wheel to get the surface of the block clean, so there's no garbage on here that'll interfere with the proper seating of our gasket. Gasket can only go on a certain way, so there's no mixing it up and by flipping it around or anything. But got the gasket seated down. Look at the cylinder head real quick. That too has been wire wheeled to get it as clean as possible. Even a little bit of the combustion chambers have been scraped. So obviously we did not take time to have this head rebuilt or otherwise gone through, because this is what we would call the dingle ball rebuild, where we just simply do rings, bearings, and gaskets. We're going on the hope that the cylinder head is in good shape. So, yep, shooting from the hip on that one. But putting the head down is going to involve putting all 10 bolts in here. 10 bolts, and then you torque them down in sequence from the middle going out in 2 different torque settings. Let me get the head on the block first. All right, with the cylinder head on, all our bolts are in position, and we're going to have to torque them down. Now, just like with any cylinder head, you always start from the middle. Our pattern is going to be like 1, 2, 3, 4, some weird pattern, but I got it in the manual here in my phone. But the process on this thing is even weirder, because first you torque them down in the sequence to 38.5 foot-pounds, then do it again to 61 foot-pounds. Then you loosen them all in a reverse sequence back to basically 0 torque as the instruction specifies. Then repeat the process again in sequence, tightening them down to 38.5 foot-pounds, and then finally to like 76 foot-pounds. So it's actually a 5-step process. Weird. Don't ask me why, but that's what the instruction says, so that's what I'm going to do. Sequence 1, 38.5 foot-pounds is done. Now we go to 60 foot-pounds. Sequence 2 is done, 61 foot-pounds. Now, sequence 3, loosening things back up in reverse order. Sequence 3 is done. The bolts were loosened in reverse order to 0 foot-pounds. How do you do that? That's where the old school torque wrench comes into play, because as well as tightening, you can also read the torque as you're loosening a bolt, and I just loosened the bolt until the torque went down to 0, and then I stopped. So you're not actually taking the bolts out or otherwise loosening them to the point where you could unscrew them by hand. There's always a method to the madness. Now, sequence 4, 2 more sequences. Round 4 is done, 38.5 foot-pounds. Now the final one, the big one, 76 foot-pounds. All right, one of the most stressful parts of this whole project, torquing these damn bolts down to such a high foot-pound number on an aluminum metal block, is complete. We're at 76 foot-pounds on all 10 bolts. It's all downhill from here. Now, the next thing is the camshafts, but there's a couple things we got to do before we can actually just slap camshafts in. One, we need to rotate the crankshaft to top dead center, which is going to involve getting the keyway, which is currently not visible, pointing up. There's actually a little mark right there too to help you line up with that. And then I'm going to have to get the camshafts, which still have their gears in place. And there's actually a couple of marks right here as well that we use for gauging that. Once we get the camshafts lined up, I could start putting the caps in and locking those down. I'm sure there's going to be some more torque sequences on that as well, because some of these lobes are going to be compressing valve springs while some are not. And if you just start wrenching on everything, you will break a camshaft. Don't ask me how I know, but let me get the hardware in place. Oh, before we forget, there's one little bitty bolt that goes right here on the left front side of the cylinder head right here. Simple little bolt, gets tightened down to 8 foot-pounds. Uses like a 4mm Allen wrench or something like that. But needs to be put in there and tightened down. And this came with our new head bolts, so yep, go ahead and put it in. Now to the camshafts. Alright, we have our camshafts in place, but no caps are on here yet because this being an interference engine, everything has to be in line when we put our timing chain on, otherwise nothing is going to rotate. But the sprockets on our camshafts have little marks on them to line things up with these little nubs right here on the head. So obviously you just turn these things and have those lined up. You're not going to keep them in position. That's where our tool comes into play later. On our crankshaft gear, you line the keyway up with that mark right there, so you know you're at top dead center on number 1 cylinder. The caps that go on here, you can't just torque them down willy-nilly because you will break a camshaft. There is a torque sequence for these things based on which valves are going to be compressed when the engine is at top dead center. So have to put some oil on these camshafts and in the journals, get everything nice and lubed up before I put the caps on. And there's also some bolts that need to be specifically placed in different spots because they do hold the valve cover on. The studs stick up through the valve cover to retain the nuts that hold the valve cover on. So get the caps on and then we'll go over the specific bolts. Give me a second. Alright, looking at our caps that are all in place, I also took a moment to put this thing on here, which I was mistaken. It is not any kind of advancing thing. It is actually just a cam sensor. No big woof. Looks big and menacing, but it's not. So my mistake on that. Anyway, the bolts in particular that you need to pay attention to are these 2 outer bolts on the 3rd caps because they're studs for the valve cover. This thing's already got studs built into it, so no worries there. And the number 5 caps, the outer ones, those need to be specifically in those spots so you'll be able to put your valve cover down and secure it with the nuts and everything. The rest of them, just the regular bolts that you pulled out. Don't forget to put your little chain plate shield thingy, whatever that's for, because that's part of the whole package as well. Now to the torque sequence. Looking at the online manual that I keep mentioning, torque sequence is shown right here for the intake and exhaust cams, and the way they have it, they just have you doing both of them kind of at the same time. Like on the intake right there, you got 1, 2 at the number 3 caps and 3, 4 on the other one. Then you jump over to number 4 cap on the intake, 5, 6, and 7, 8. Then you jump across to number 2 cap, 9, 10, 11, 12. Same thing like with the cylinder heads. You're starting in the middle and you're just going back and forth, front to back, front to back. So let me go ahead and get the torque specs so we can get this garbage snugged down. Go ahead and scroll over to that. Okay. The torque for these camshaft housing, they call them, is 8 foot-pounds. Thought that was rather light given what these things are actually doing, but double checked and yeah, 8 foot-pounds. So okay, we got our sequence and we got our number, so let me go ahead and get this garbage tightened down. Give me a little bit of time. Stand by. Alright, we got all our camshaft housings torqued down to 8 foot-pounds. It's a little bit of a anxious thing because, well, we don't want to break our camshafts, but everything is nice and secured. Made sure I could at least rotate these things a little bit, but because it's an interference engine, you can't really do anything. So anyway, next move is going to be to get these camshafts locked down so we can get our timing marks lined up and go ahead and start putting the timing chain on there. So that'll be next. All right, when we're doing our timing chain assembly installation, you're pretty much going to have to pull all this garbage off. The old camshaft sprockets, they got to come off. If your kit's any good, you're going to have all new sprockets as well as the chains and the tensioner hardware and everything. And we already have all the new gears in place, crank gear, this intermediate gear, and the 2 cam gears. These things have like a little notch, there's like a little cotter pin inside the camshaft to help hold the thing in place, even with the bolt down. Now, for a mental note, those bolts get torqued down to like 57.5 foot-pounds. And how do you do that? There's a couple of lobes right here that allow you to put a large wrench on there. Now, I don't have a metric size for that. That instruction manual, that online manual, will have that, but I found that a 1 1/16 wrench fit on there just fine. It's probably going to be something like 32 millimeter or some huge size, but whatever. But in order to put the chains on, all this stuff has to be off because, well, you're not going to just throw the chain on here and be able to do it with everything in place. So first thing I got to do is actually put our crankshaft chain on here, because that one is at the back here and our camshaft gears are at the front. So I'll go ahead and get our crank chain and let's look at that. Okay, on our crank gear, there's a little dot on there that's going to be oriented at the bottom, opposite of the keyway, which will be lined up with this little mark right here. On the intermediate gear, same thing. A little dot right there, opposite of this arrow right here. Now, if you notice, the chain has a bronze-colored link on there for you to line the chain up with the two. So it's almost idiot-proof, because between the dots and the keyway being lined up with the mark there and there, you also have these little bronze chain links to also help you. Redundancy. Now, I did have to take that gear off to pull this gear off and put it back on with the chain on there, because as you can see, there's a little bit of a clearance issue right there. But with the crank chain and pulley and intermediate on there, now we go on to those suckers. Okay, on our camshaft sprockets, same thing. You have little arrows that are opposite of these little cotter pins here that, well, while the cotter pins are supposed to line up with these little lugs right here, the arrows are actually pointing up to those bronze pieces, those bronze chain links, so you'll know exactly where to place your chain. Again, redundancy. And then same thing there. We got an arrow pointing at that bronze chain link, so all this is together. Now, that wrench is going to come into play because with some of these valve springs under pressure, you're not going to have both of these camshafts perfectly lined up. So you're going to have to put one cam gear or sprocket on first and then work the other one with your wrench to get them to line up to where you get the bronze links lined up with the arrows. Same thing with there. You're going to have to just, at least have to just do one of the camshafts to get everything to line up. But as long as those bronze links are lined up with those arrows, you will be good, because you still have all your chain tensioning hardware to put on. Same thing with the crankshaft chain. That's next. All right, our second chain tensioner, as they call it, the one for the cam set here, is this thing right here, and it's going to go right here. Now, when you removed everything, you would have done good to save the little metal gasket that goes between the head and this tensioner, because, well, they didn't provide one in the timing chain set. Go figure. But the little plate is actually in good shape. There's still material, like some black material on there and everything, so it's reusable. And there's two 10mm bolts and a large nut that goes on this shaft right here for the intermediate gear. Now, you put all that together, that nut there is supposed to be tightened like 33 foot-pounds. I'll correct it if necessary, but the two 10mm bolts are 8 foot-pounds. So we'll go ahead and throw this together, and we'll move on with that one as well. And this one has a couple different numbers on it, but I'll get back to you on that. Stand by. Okay, we have our second tensioner on here, and yeah, that was 33 foot-pounds for that thing, 8 for these bolts right here. Now, the new hardware, because this stuff does spring out, they at least took the liberty of putting a little retaining pin in here to hold this stuff together so it doesn't just shoot out and end up giving you the blues. But this is all in place now, so we're good on here. These bolts here are installed back in here and torqued down to 57.5 foot-pounds. All our timing marks are still lined up as they're supposed to be. One other note, if you hadn't already seen it, there is a hub bushing that goes inside this intermediate gears or sprocket, so make sure you retain that when you disassemble this thing. Moving along, we have our chain tensioner for our crankshaft chain right here. And just like I mentioned about a bushing, same thing. Make sure you keep this stuff, otherwise you're going to have a hard time probably trying to find this crap. But this thing here, you got that piece there, and then you actually have the tensioner piece that goes right here to push against that piece right there to put tension on the chain. It's all hydraulic, using oil pressure from your oil pump. And this one's got a little thing in there holding it together, otherwise this piston will just shoot out. Don't want that. So, and also these bolts here, 10mm bolts, are torqued down to 8 foot-pounds. There's also a couple of chain guide bolts, these little odd bolts that are here and here. Those are actually torqued down to 6.5 foot-pounds. And then I'll get to this here once I get this other garbage put on. Let me do that real quick. All right, got everything in place. This thing here, that big nut right there, is tensioned down to 18.5 foot-pounds. Going down, we got our 8 foot-pound torque bolts. Our tensioner bolts right here, that black plastic piece, those are 6.5 foot-pounds. And everything is still straight. We got our, let's see, right there, all that crap lined up down there, as is there, right there, there, and there. So all this garbage is in and lined up. Took the liberty of removing the spark plugs from the cylinder head, so cranking this thing over should be a little easier without compression. So let me go ahead and do that. One last thing you'll want to do before you even try to move any of this garbage is wet it down with some oil, so all the chain guides and the chain tensioners, all that stuff is coated in oil, so you're not just metal on plastic, because most of this crap is plastic like the guide and stuff. But we got rotation. Complete rotation, meaning our interference engine is not interfering with itself. So with that, we can move on to covering all this trash up. Timing cover, valve cover. There's some O-rings and stuff that go in the valve cover and all, but that'll be next. Getting close. All right. The next thing we got to do is install our timing cover and valve cover. Starting with the timing cover, there's a couple things you got to do. First thing is replace your front seal. The old one is just a simple matter of using something like a flathead screwdriver or something similar and a hammer to just carefully tap the thing out. It'll pop out easy. Putting the new one in is a matter of taking the thing, placing it in the hole, and if you don't have the special tools Suzuki recommends, you could use one of our special tools, a piece of wood, and put it on the surface so you can get an even contact when you tap on it with a hammer to get the thing started, making sure that it's even. You go ahead and just carefully work it with the wood between the hammer and the seal so you don't damage the seal, unless you got a mallet. And then you could just use a mallet directly on here and just work the thing in, going all the way around until the seal is perfectly flush with the timing cover surface. Next thing you got to do, because these things don't actually use any kind of gasket, is squirt a bunch of gasket maker on both sides of the timing cover and on this stud, this surface here where a stud goes through, and that'll be ready to put on. As for the valve cover, there's a couple things you got to do to it just as well to get it ready. First thing is replacing all your O-rings in here so you don't get any leakage problems right there. A simple pick will allow you to pull the O-rings out, and you take your new ones. These are old ones, by the way, but take your new ones, grease them up, and then just work them back in the grooves, and they're ready to rock and roll. Then there's also a matter of your valve cover gasket, which is a one-piece gasket that just presses lightly into the groove around the valve cover. Nothing special you got to do to it otherwise. So that'll be ready. Then the last thing that you have to make note of when you go to put the thing on is the little rubber-ish O-rings, that are not O-rings, washers that come in your rebuild kit that you put with your bolts to secure the valve cover in place. Then the last thing, before you do put the valve cover on, there's a few points you got to put some sealant down so the thing won't leak at little junctions, like where your timing cover mates up to the engine block and head, or really the head, but this surface here and on the other side, got to put some sealant there. And then this surface here where our cam sensor goes, like right here and here, and on this little rubber half moon shaped piece that also should have been replaced when working with the cylinder head. If I didn't make note of that, my bad. Replace the little half moon shaped thing before you put all this garbage together. But you do have to put some sealant on there so all the stuff will seal when the valve cover is secured. All the bolts for the valve cover and the timing cover are torqued down to 8 foot-pounds. So Suzuki seems to love 8 foot-pounds of torque. But let me get this stuff on. All right, we got our timing cover and valve cover in place. Every fastener is torqued down to 8 foot-pounds, save for the nut that goes on here because a pulley is supposed to go there, and we won't be getting to that until we're installing all the garbage on the front that was on this engine when we first got it. But as stated before, had to put some gasket maker at some joints where everything mated together. And one other thing to make note of, before putting all this stuff on, have a mallet handy, because you are going to need a mallet to seat the timing cover, because there's little bushings on either side that need to be persuaded to accept this timing cover. And because all this garbage is aluminum, you can't just go hammer happy, otherwise you will be breaking this stuff. But a mallet will allow you to safely tap all around it where needed to carefully seat the thing on there so you're over the stud and you're on top of your oil pan gasket, because you also don't want to damage that thing either, beating the thing too much or just forcing it on there. And then this thing, same thing with the new O-rings here going over these holes where your spark plugs go. You're gonna have to persuade this thing to take a seat on top of the head, and just like I said, mallet in different spots, seating the thing down slowly until it's all the way down. And you can look all the way around and notice that the thing has a nice even sandwiching of your gasket, nothing pinched out or anything. And then you can put all your little cap nuts on here. One thing I do want to make note of, there is a regular bolt right here, because upon trying to torque down the cap nut to the simple little 8 foot-pounds it asked for, it actually stripped the tip of the stud inside the camshaft housing. So the valve cover had to come back off, the stud had to come out of the camshaft housing, and a bolt substituted for the strip stud and cap nut. But all is good. All the other ones are torqued down as intended, along with our substitute bolt. So with that all said and done, we can now start putting some of this other garbage back on here. Got several things: water pump and coolant tube housing, intake and exhaust manifolds, fuel rails, some pulleys, let's say a few little odds and ends, motor mount brackets. That pretty much not too much stuff left that was on this engine, but let's go ahead and get to that garbage next. All right, we're in the home stretch here with our engine. The next thing we need to do is basically put all the stuff on that is associated with the engine. Never mind that. That's a spare. But yeah, we got our water pump, AC compressor bracket, tension pulley, alternator, power steering pump, compressor, motor mount brackets, miscellaneous hoses and other brackets, exhaust and intake, and fuel rail. All this stuff is going to go on. I'm going to do a speed up of the installation of all this stuff on here and flash the torque specs for the different bolts or nuts that are used to hold all these components in place, so we can go ahead and just get past the peripherals, because our main focus was getting the internals of this engine addressed. So stand by. Of course, you're going to have different little gaskets and O-rings that are utilized on components such as our water pump, which has a O-ring right there for the mount that goes on the side of the block. And then of course there's a gasket that goes back here for the tube that goes over for carrying coolant. Make sure you replace all that stuff. Unless there's any reason you've already replaced that stuff with new hardware, there may be no need to, but since you have the stuff in your rebuild kit, just go ahead and replace it. Make note of any O-rings and gaskets and swap them out, since you already got all this trash torn apart and are currently putting it back together. So let's get to work with all this stuff. We got our engine all put back together. Everything that came on it, in addition to some extra stuff that I had laying around from another engine, the one that was originally pulled out of the big tracker that was seized up. I saved all the peripheral stuff, the alternator and AC compressor, power steering pump. So I was pretty much able to put all this garbage back together. Only thing I got to get is a harmonic balancer slash pulley to put on there, and serpentine belt, of course. But everything else is on here, and we're pretty much ready to install this thing in the big tracker. But we're not going to do that quite yet. Stay tuned for that video. That'll be part 2 on this tracker engine project. So for right now, we're done. Engine's ready to rock and roll. It turns over and everything. So till the next time, as usual, like, subscribe, notifications, TikTok, all that good stuff. Stay tuned for part 2 of the engine build slash installation, and hopefully we'll be rolling. So catch you later. I'm out.